Welcome to the Ascent of Mount Carmel YouTube channel. Today we've reached the second book and we're on the 19th chapter. And here St. John talks about how even if visions and revelations are true, and even if they come from God, we may still be deceived by them. And this chapter discusses how that can be. There are actually two reasons for this, and in this chapter St. John's going to discuss the first of them. And that reason is we can be deceived because of the defective way in which we understand these visions and revelations. When God speaks to us, we may encounter the same sort of communication problem that occurs when people who speak two different languages try to talk to each other. In God's prophecies and revelations, he tends to employ ways, concepts, and methods of seeing things that are completely different from our normal ways of understanding things. And he often conveys a much bigger picture than we can even grasp. For example, in Genesis, God says to Abram, "I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land so that you might possess it." Abram understood this to mean that he would personally possess the land, so he asked, "Lord, whereby or by what sign am I to know that I am to possess it?" So later in the chapter, God clarifies for him that the prophecy is going to be fulfilled through his descendants. God had made a promise that was true. Abram had understood it in a different way than what was explained to him. If Abraham had acted according to his personal understanding of it, he probably would have fallen into some sort of error. We see something similar later in Genesis when God talks to Jacob. "Fear not, go down into Egypt, for I will make a great nation of you. I will go down with you thither, and I will bring you back again from there." To our normal way of understanding, it would look like that God didn't keep his promise to Jacob when he didn't bring him back out from Egypt and he died there. However, the promise was fulfilled through Jacob's descendants, just as the earlier promise had been fulfilled through Abraham's descendants. God brought those descendants out from Egypt in the book Exodus, so while the words of God are always true, their meaning can be easily misunderstood. This is why we're usually fooled when we try to interpret dreams and visions. We treat them at face value. We discussed this earlier, that God gives us imaginary visions to help us form a habit of devotion. The words of the visions is sort of like the rind of the fruit, but the spirit of the visions is the flesh of the fruit, and the spirit is much more profound. The letter killeth, but the spirit quickens. We have to be cognizant that the spiritual language of God in prophecy is different and far removed from our understanding. Jeremiah wrote, "Alas, alas, alas, O Lord God, has God then deceived this people, and Jerusalem, saying, You shall have peace, and behold, the sword reaches even to the soul?" The prophecy that Jeremiah was speaking of was the prophecy speaking of the coming of Jesus, and he would bring the peace. However, the Jews of Jeremiah's time were looking for worldly and political peace. Since they understood the prophecy literally, they felt deceived. "We looked for peace, and no good came." Before the coming of Jesus, it would have been easy to be confused and to go astray when reading the 71st Psalm. "For he shall deliver the poor from the mighty, and the needy that had no helper." However, in the New Testament, Jesus tells us that the poor would be with us always. We now realize that Jesus did save all poor men through his death and resurrection. Prophecies and revelations need to be viewed in a spiritual manner if we hope to understand them. Our vision is fogged when we get hung up on the letter of prophecy while ignoring the spirit and its real truth. Another example of the inability of people to understand these things is that shortly after the death of Jesus, even his own disciples didn't really believe the resurrection. In Luke it says, "And these words seemed to them as idle tales, and they did not believe them." They had expected that the Christ would come as a temporal king. Even moments before his ascension, his disciples asked Jesus, "Lord, wilt thou at this time restore again the kingdom of Israel?" Here's another example. Suppose that somebody prays to God because he's being persecuted by his enemies and he's praying for deliverance. And suppose that God answers him and says, "I will deliver you from your enemies." And this prophecy may be true, but his enemies may prevail against him and he might be killed. God might have been speaking of true deliverance, which is salvation, where the soul is victorious. Here's another example. As you probably know, martyrs are assured of heaven because they've given everything that they have to God. So let's suppose that because of this, somebody prays to be a martyr because they know that they'll be assured heaven. And that person might have had a vision where God answers him and says, "You will be a martyr." And this will give the person expectation that he will die a martyr's death. But let's say that person never does die in that way. However, God's promise might have still been true. Perhaps the person becomes like a white martyr, meaning that he's persecuted and loses everything he has except his life for God's sake. Though he isn't killed as a martyr, that person will receive a reward that belongs to a martyr. Although prophecies might not be fulfilled in the way we initially understood them, they are fulfilled in another way, and a better way often, and that would be in a way that better honors God. So, although revelations may come from God, we can't always be sure of their meaning because we can't understand them correctly. The words of God are infinite in their layers and their texture. St. John tells us that some of our attempts to understand these things is just nothing but an attempt to grasp the air. St. John tells us that imaginary visions are no more than just spiritual particles. We need to be vigilant that we don't become sucked into these things and start analyzing them. We'll talk more about this in the next installment. Now, this is not to say that we will never be able to interpret the sayings of God. The point is that we can't judge them according to our senses. We can only understand the things of God by darkening ourselves to the senses and listening through our theological virtue of faith. We need to develop the necessary wisdom and understanding to do this. The spiritual man isn't bound or guided by his senses. But the sensual man perceives not these things that are of the Spirit of God, for it is foolishness to him, and he cannot understand because it is spiritually examined. But the spiritual man judges all things. So in summary, the words and visions that are from God may be true, yet we may easily be deceived by them because we might interpret them in a manner that God didn't intend them. The best and surest course is for us to be prudent and cast these things aside. Well, I hope you enjoyed this installment of Ascent of Mount Carmel. We'll be back again in about a week. Perhaps it might be 2 with this one, with another installment. In the meantime, please pray for the church.
The sea bound. Now you got the blues bound. You don't know what to do. You want to see them, wonder where they're at, wonder where they're going. Wonder why they see me. I trust them with everything I had. I done everything. I turned my heart to them with faith and belief in them. And then they get up and deceive me. Now you don't know whether to cut their throat or to cry again.